Hey, this is Mike Nagoda, and you're listening to Talking Blues.
Nagoda, what nationality is Nagoda?
So, we don't know. My dad's side of the family is like Central European, so Polish Ukrainian.
Okay.
But my grandfather, my dad's father, we're not sure where he's from. We know that he moved to like Poland to marry my babcia, my grandmother. But we're not really sure where he's from. He might be from Croatia. He seems to have cousins in Croatia. But so it might be a Croatian last name, it might be a Polish last name, it might be a Ukrainian name. We're not really too sure. It's just kind of Eastern Central European within that region of the world.
Okay, because when I looked it up, it also mentioned Middle Eastern as a possibility, and it almost in some ways it almost sounds Japanese as well. So I was curious.
Everybody thinks I'm Japanese, and I am not. Everybody always assumes that. They go, "Oh, are you Japanese?" And I go, "No, I am not Japanese. I am far from Japanese."
Well, it does sound like a Japanese name. So, Mike, tell me about your musical journey. I know you started with the piano, but tell me how you got into music.
So, I was always around music growing up with my parents. I came from a musical family. My mom and my dad led the choir at our local Catholic church, and they're still leading that choir to this day. They haven't stopped. And so I was around mostly church music, sacred music, for a very long time. And it was either that or classical music. Um, I was not exposed to secular music until I was about 12 years old, 12 or 13. Very different from most kids. But how I got into playing music is my mom got me started on piano lessons. I guess because she wanted to prove the doctors wrong because they told her that I would never play a musical instrument because I have cerebral palsy. And so I guess she thought, well, I'll show them. And so she signed me up for piano lessons when I was 6. And I struggled and I struggled and I struggled. And I went through a very wonderful, patient teacher, wonderful woman by the name of Maureen Hickey, who taught me for years and years and years. And I can't remember what level we got up to. I think maybe grade 1 or 2 of the Royal Conservatory of Music. And then I switched to another teacher, Linda Fennell, and she taught me until I got all the way up to grade 8 in the RCM.
Wow.
And that's where I stopped. So I did classical piano for over 20 years.
So, can I ask you, and forgive me for being ignorant, but tell me how your cerebral palsy, how it affects you.
Sure. So for people who don't know, cerebral palsy is a neurological disability. What happens is when you are born for some reason or another, and it usually happens with premature pregnancy. I was born 6 months premature. I was tiny. I was like smaller than the palm of your hand when I was
6
born.
months premature?
Yeah.
Wow.
I almost died several times apparently, but I'm still here and kicking. So, but yeah, I was a fighter and a shit disturber from day one. But so yeah, so cerebral palsy. What happens is when you're born, there's a moment where, for whatever reason, there's lack of oxygen to your brain, and that causes brain damage. And so it ends up affecting there's a range of disability. So there's people who are less disabled, and there are people who are way more disabled. When I was born, I was extremely disabled. I couldn't walk, I couldn't crawl. How I got around for the first 5.5 years of my life was I scooched along on my belly because I couldn't even crawl. And then when I was 5.5, I was a candidate for an experimental surgery at the time, and it's now become the gold standard for kids with CP. My type of cerebral palsy is called spastic diplegia, and so certain types of CP will affect one side or more over the other. So some people have it more on their left side of their body, some people have it more on the right side of their body. I have it all over, and my whole body is spastic and very, 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 very tight. All the muscles in my hands. So when I was 5.5, I had an experimental surgery called a selective dorsal rhizotomy. And essentially, they went in and they snipped the nerves in my lower back to release some of the spasticity and tension in my body. And they didn't expect me to walk. And 5 weeks later, I was walking. And the doctors were like, they were fucking shocked. They were just so they were so utterly shocked with that, and
Okay,
they
so
weren't expecting it.
now do you remember this? Like five is a long time ago. So do you
Yeah.
have recollection of
Yep.
one the surgery and then the fact that you weren't able to walk and then you were able to walk?
Yeah. Yeah. I have very vivid memories of going into the surgery. I remember during the surgery I had a nightmare about like a billy goat kicking me off a mountain, and then I woke up on the operating table. They're just like, kids have weird dreams. And then the 5 weeks later, I remember taking my first steps very, very vividly. So I was at my grandfather's house, and he said to me, "Boy, get over here, come over here." And I said, "I don't know I can." And he says, "Oh, I think you can." And my grandfather was like, he was like an army sergeant who fought in the Second World War. Like he never made it over to Europe, but like basically he got hurt in a training accident where like he rolled down a cliff in a tank and survived in
Jeez.
like in Newfoundland, and he got it with like a couple of scratches in the hospital, and like my grandmother was pissed at him and was like, "Don't do that to me again." But he was like this very stern, very like authoritarian, tough old man, and he's like, "Get over here." And I turned to my mom and I said, "How do I do this? Like, how do I walk?" She's like, "Move your right foot and then your left." And I said, "How do I do that?" Because I didn't know how to do that. So she had to show me. And I took one step and then another. And then before I knew it, I was across the other side of the room with my grandfather. And then I walked, and he says, "Okay, and walk back." And I walked all the way back.
Wow. So at that point, do you know, because I don't know how much exposure you would have had to other kids at that point, but did you know that you were different, that you couldn't walk, or did you know that, like, how were you feeling about things?
I don't think before the age of 6 I knew I was different.
Okay.
I think uh, with like in kindergarten, my teachers and my parents protected me fairly well from ableism and bullying and the outside world. But when I turned 6, all of that changed. I was bullied relentlessly for being disabled, um, for years and years and years and years. And little kids can be really nasty,
How did you deal with
luckily.
that?
Uh, Not well. Basically, mm, the teachers would give them a slap on the wrist, or the principal would give them a slap on the wrist. And my parents tried to talking to them, and the school board wouldn't listen. And I got beat up and verbally abused and had all sorts of ableist slurs thrown at me like spaz and retard and all that kind of shit. And then when I got older, I had a whole bunch of homophobic slurs, like I got called a fag and a faggot and stuff, and by kids on the schoolyard. And I didn't even know I was queer at that point. So like all I knew in my head was that like gay is bad, you know? That was kind of like, and plus I like all the homophobic messaging in the church that I received from like my priests and the church community and my folks. I came out of it not having a very good opinion of myself. And because people weren't really listening to me, I was pretty fucked up as a result of that, and continued to be well into adulthood. And I've only been getting help for it now for like the last 5 years or so. So I'm healing and I'm dealing with it. But yeah, my childhood was a lot, a lot, a lot.
I am so sorry to hear that. That's horrible, but I'm so sorry you had to go through that.
So am
Tell me
I.
about the piano and having what you had and your mom saying I'm going to prove them wrong. How and I know that you said it was difficult, but the fact that you went to grade 8 obviously meant that you went to a certain level and you were pretty good at playing. How did that
Yeah.
come about?
I think my teachers were just, they were sort of a combination of gentle and pushing me just a little bit. Like my left side is my weaker side. So when I play piano, my left hand is not all that active. It's mostly my right hand, and usually I'll just kind of hold down chords. And so I can't really do a lot of moving bass lines. So when I would try to play somebody like Bach, where the the Alberti bass in like Baroque music is constantly moving and your left hand is constantly moving, that was hell. I hated that. I love Bach's music. I hate playing him for obvious reasons. I can't do it very well. But then when I got into the older grades for piano, I discovered Chopin and I discovered Grieg and I discovered pieces where I could just hold these chords and my left hand didn't have to move too much, and I might have to stretch and it might push me, but it was just stuff that I preferred. So I think I just preferred the romantic composers, to be honest with you, because it was just better for my hands and for my body, and I could just kind of lean into the chords and get really expressive with it and kind of emote a lot better than anything I could with like Bach or oh fucking Muzio Clementi. I hated him. He was my worst. He was my worst enemy growing up in classical piano.
When did you? I'm always curious. I mean, you had music all around you, so I presume you had some appreciation of music
Mhm.
very early on. Um, Tell me, at what point do you become appreciative of the music you're playing? When is it not a task that you've been given, but something that is part of you that you enjoy doing?
When I was in university, when I was about 19, I formed a progressive metal band and I played keyboards in that band. And that's when I started figuring out things. And I think the first time I found out that there was more to scales than just the harmonic minor or the natural minor, that there was like a pentatonic scale existed or a blues scale existed, was one of the kids uh, in my grade 12 class at my prom. I was sitting at the piano and he showed me the C blues scale. And I'm like, wait, what's this? There's another scale. What is this scale? I don't know the scale. This isn't in classical music. Where did this come from? Right? And so um it was a real revelation to me. And then I suddenly figured at that point I'd started listening to secular music. So the very first secular music I was exposed to were like the only two cassettes my dad had in the car that weren't religious were The Grand Illusion by Styx and Songs from the Wood by Jethro Tull.
Wow.
That's very, 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 very different. But I grew up to that, and then when I was 16, I started hearing about Pink Floyd, and I begged my father to let me get a best of Pink Floyd CD, and he was like, my dad was like super religious. He's like, well, I don't know, Michael, I don't know, but eventually he let me go to HMV with my allowance money to buy it, and the only reason I bought it was because I'd heard about this band and I heard they were amazing and I heard that and their name sounded cool. I was a teenager. I didn't know anything. And so I got the best of it was the Echoes compilation. I still have it. And I put it in and I heard the opening chords to Astronomy Domine, which is off the first Floyd record, and my mind was just blowing. I'd never heard anything like it in my life. And then I heard all the stuff with David Gilmour, and when I heard David Gilmour play guitar, I was like, oh, what is this? And I heard all these bends and this expressiveness. And I was like, what scales are they playing? So when my friend showed me the blues scale, the light bulb went on in my head. And I'm like, oh my God, that's the David Gilmour scale. That's the Pink Floyd scale. And that's when I started looking into who David Gilmour was influenced by, and he was influenced by B.B. King. And that's how I heard about B.B. King was for the first time. So I actually came to blues music through prog rock, which is very, very, very unusual. But then, so after I discovered Pink Floyd, I discovered Deep Purple, who's my other favorite rock band from the 70s. And so I grew up listening to 70s prog rock and classic metal. And then I was in that progressive metal band for like 10 years until we it just kind of dissolved. And but in between that time, I really wanted to learn guitar. And that's when I became interested around 16. And I started out with just laying it on my lap, tuning into an open chord and playing it with my thumb because I can't play it with my fingers.
So explain that to me. So you can't just sit down and have your guitar like how people know how guitars are usually held. So
No,
you would have to do it more like Jeff Healey.
I tried to do it like Jeff Healey, and I couldn't. My palsy wouldn't wouldn't let me form the chords this way with the guitar, you know, in the usual position, and it wouldn't let me on my lap. And I tried to form the chords like him. Like everybody when they see me, they say, "You play like Jeff Healey," and I'm like, "No, I don't. I don't play anything like Jeff Healey. Stop confusing me with him."
But did you have problems with the keyboards? Like were you able to play? I mean, the fact that you got the grade A tells me that you were able to play piano pretty efficiently.
Yeah, and that's the thing that was really interesting about it was that I figured, well, if I sit the guitar on my lap and I try to form the chords from the top down with my fingers like Jeff did, because I knew who Jeff was at that point, I thought it should be similar to piano. This should this should work, but it didn't. And years later, I realized it was because when you play the piano, when you form the chords on the piano, and when you try to form the same chords in a similar manner on the guitar on your lap, you're actually using a different set of muscles in your hand. And so, for whatever reason, the muscles that got engaged when I played piano like that versus the muscles that I use playing guitar, my body liked one group of muscles and it did not like the other. And this is also the reason why I can't play finger style with my fingers. I tried and tried and tried. I tried playing with my fingers. I tried playing with finger picks when I took up lap steel. My right hand was like, no, not happening. And so I took up and started playing guitar with a flat pick. And I thought this is how lap steel players, slide players, everybody plays with a flat pick, right? And then it was only years later, but I learned, oh no, that's very unorthodox. You're not supposed to do that. What are you doing? And that it's actually very frowned upon within the lap steel um, community and the pedal steel community. And so, yeah, when I started playing guitar, I just tried to play with my thumb, borrowed it across on the open tuning after failing to play it like Jeff Healey. And that only got me so far. And then I started taking lessons with a fellow great bluesman out of Hamilton by the name of Frank Cosentino, who I'm pretty sure you've probably heard of.
Sure.
Um, and Frank taught me my blues rudiments on guitar for about 6 or 7 years. And then uh, for about a year, we tried with the thumb and it wasn't working. And then one day he's like, "What about a slide? What about lap steel?" And I'm like, "What is what's that? What's that? I don't know what that is." And he showed me pictures and he explained what it was. And I was working at a TV station for a summer job in the editing room. And so I had this money from my job and it was right close to where all the pawn shops were on Church Street in Toronto. And so I walked into McTamney's one day and there was this old Gibson lap steel hanging on the wall, and it was made out of the old Carina wood that they used to make the old flying V's out of. It was like from the early 60s. And I saw this thing in my jaw, just like it was just like it was like the thing was like shining light, and it was like it was calling my name.
But
And
had
I'm like,
you listened to like did you have lap steel musicians that you followed by that time or not?
yeah, 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 yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yes. Like the first huge, big, major influence on me on slide was Robert Randolph. And he is a large reason why my sound is the way it is. Like I don't really play like a traditional lap steel player in that like I did not want to play country, even though I was expected to. I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. That doesn't interest me. But when I heard Robert Randolph and I heard this very overdriven pedal steel, and he had all this influence from rock music and blues, and he had that really wild, wide vibrato in his playing. I'm like, what is that? I need to steal that, and that's where I stole my vibrato from was Robert Randolph, and just like my approach and my sound.
Okay, so I need to go back a little bit. A couple of things
Yep.
that I have to ask. Why Grand Illusion and Songs of the Wood? Any idea why those two cassettes would have been in your dad's car?
According to my father, and I'm an atheist now, so don't ask me to understand the religious logic, because I don't. Um,
But it's
but
connected to religion.
yes, it does. So according to my father, he he became a born again Christian in his early adulthood, and he threw out most of his secular music. So because he thought those were of the devil, and then he kept those two cassettes. I think because he said that he thought that they had a quote unquote positive message, and so he felt that like he could keep them because they weren't satanic or something. And this is what he explained to me when I asked him about it. Like, we used to take car rides up to our property in the summer that like my grandfather owned when he was still with us, and where I used to go camping every summer. And so my dad and I would take these long trips up, and we'd always used to listen to either Songs from the Wood or Styx or like very bad Christian rock bands. And so I was like exposed to rock music through very bad like Christian music before I was ever exposed to secular music.
Okay, the other question is about when you were in that progressive rock band playing, I presume, Deep Purple or Pink Floyd or whatever. How difficult was that for you? Like, how was it? How difficult was that to execute being a progressive rock keyboardist?
I was actually pretty decent um, at it, and we weren't covering anything. We actually wrote our own stuff, and we were a a mishmash of various influences. I was coming from blues and prog rock. Our bass player was coming from punk. Our various guitar players were coming from either like grunge or metal, and our drummer had like a rock and a jazz background. So it was just this very wide pistache of influences. And everybody who heard us said, "You don't sound like anybody else. You guys just sound like you guys," which is like the biggest compliment anybody could ever give
For
us.
sure.
We weren't very, I don't think we were great. Like, when I listen back to our old recordings, I'm not sure we were like good, but like there were some nights where like we were on, and it was mostly us goofing off in our vocalist basement for over 10 years and getting a few gigs, but it was a hell of a fun time. And for me, it was that point where it's like I was trying to get away from classical music and kind of find my own voice as a musician. I think that's where it started. And it's like, even though I was very much like trying to sound like, say, John Lord from Deep Purple or Rick Wright from Pink Floyd, I was still trying to find my voice. So I was experimenting with Hammonds and synthesizers and all sorts of weird sounds. So I was like a kid in a candy shop. Um, and then it wasn't until years later when I met Brian Kober that I kind of went through the same thing with lap steel and slide guitar.
Okay, before we get to
Um,
Brian, let me ask you about. I mean, I see the keyboard behind you right now. Is classical music in your world at all anymore? Do you still play classical or listen to classical at all?
I listen to it occasionally. I haven't played classical piano in a very, very, very long time. Um, Honestly, that's what my mother wanted for me. It's not what I wanted for me. But I will say that I appreciated it, all the lessons, because it taught me discipline more than anything else, and just basically stick with something. And I actually regret actually not finishing the RCM and getting my ARCT degree at the end. So someday, at some point, I want to go back and finish what I started, and I also want to finish all of the theory programs. I actually the theory courses that I took at the RCM, the grade 1 and 2 rudiments, that was the big game changer for me, because I took the piano theory and the classical theory. That's how I was able to transfer over to the guitar, because I was starting to use all my theoretical knowledge of like, okay, well, what builds the chord? What builds the functional harmony for a minor chord or a minor sevenths? So when I started taking up double slide and figuring that out, my classical piano, all the years of piano lessons actually came in useful. And it became a much easier transition than how it might have gone if I hadn't had all that. So I think it was there in my life for a purpose, to
Okay,
be honest.
so Frank says, well, you're not really, I'm not sure if he's saying you're not really getting this, but he says, try the slide. You go on to the steel pedal guitar, but then one day you meet Brian Culver. Tell me
Yeah.
about what, tell me a little bit about Brian. I got a chance to see him a couple times, and I know he played a very unique style. But tell me about that day that you went to see him and what it did for you.
So how I found out about him was the place that I was taking piano lessons at. There was this kid who was always on before my lesson. Very little boy, maybe about like 12 or 13. I was about 19 or 20 at the time. So during his lesson, before my lesson, his dad and I would always talk and chat and hang out. And he liked a lot of the same prog kind of music that I did. And he said, because he knew I was playing lap steel at that point with just one slide. And at this point, I was getting very frustrated because I could only play major chords or power chords. And I wanted to be able to play minors and other kinds of chords, but I couldn't. And Frank and I were kind of just like, what do we do? And we were kind of coming up blank. And so this guy, one day before my lesson, he says to me, there's this guy who plays at Grossman's on Sunday night, and he plays with two slides. And I thought, two slides? What does that look like? And um he next week he came back and he actually had a slide made for me out of a shotgun barrel. I've still got it, and it only covers one string. And so when I heard about double slide, I thought one went on one hand and one went on the other, and I thought Brian was doing like a tapping thing, like Eddie Van Halen,
Right.
and I was completely wrong. And so I begged my dad to take me to Grossman's when I was 19 on a Sunday night. And my father, being my very religious father and being very protective of me, was like, I don't know, Michael. Grossman's is a dive is a dive bar. It's a really seedy place. I don't know if you want to go there. And I was like, please, dad, please, dad, please, dad, take me. He's like, okay, fine, but I'm coming with you. So we walked in. I'd never been in a bar in my life, let alone a dive bar. It was I was terrified. I was very green. I was 19. It was super sketchy. I'm like, what is this place? What is this place? And then I sat down. We got there before Brian and his band, the Nationals, set up. And I still cannot, words can't describe, words can't describe how amazing it was to see Brian play for the first time. So the first thing I'll say was I was completely wrong about my conception of double slide guitar because what was really going on was Brian had a modified steel bar, the kind that the lap steel players or the pedal steel players will hold in their hands, but he had a modified version where um, you've got a tube slide welded onto it so you can actually stick it on your middle finger. And then that leaves his thumb free. And his thumb is where he puts on the double slide, the secret weapon. So that thumb slide covers 3 extra strings. And I later found out that when I asked Brian what tuning he said, I'm in open E tuning. And I'm like, oh my God, that's the tuning I'm in. And so it was just a happy coincidence. And so when I watched him play, he was getting all the chords that I'd been trying to get for well over a year at this point. And
And
that I
and are you like when you're watching it? Do you get it? Do you think, yeah, okay, this is the way it works. I can make it work. Does it come to you that quickly?
my jaw dropped, and at some point during that night, I said to myself, that's exactly what I want to do for the rest of my life. It changed, it was a game changer. It changed everything because I'd wanted to play electric guitar since I was a teenager, since I was 13, 14, you know. Um, yeah, even though I didn't really know what blues music was, when I heard the Styx record or the Jethro Tull record, I just loved the sound
Right.
of the electric guitar. I'm like, I want to play that. I don't want to play piano. I want to play that. And when I saw Brian play, it was like, oh my God, that's it. That's it. That's how I do this. And my jaw must have been on the floor the whole night. And then Brian finished his set. I came up to him. I told him I played lap steel. He got so excited. He got really, 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 really excited. Um, because they hardly ever, I guess he hardly ever got lap steel players at the jam. So he got me up on stage with the Nationals, and all I could play in was E at the time because that's what my guitar was tuned to. And he's like, "You can you play an A?" And I'm like, "No, I can't do A. I can only do E." So I think we did like "Sweet Home Chicago." We tried to do "Rocky Mountain Way" by Joe Walsh, but as I soon found out, Brian hates the Eagles, so he stopped the song halfway through and said, "Okay, that's enough of that." Um, even though I love, even though I love Joe Walsh, admittedly, that's the one area where I think Brian and I had a bit of a different taste in music. And I think we did like Sky is Crying by Elmore James was the last one, but we did it in E instead of A. And see, and then afterwards he's like, you see, Mike, this is what the double slide allows you to do because you can play in any key you want. And you don't need to retune. You don't need to have like 5 or 6 freaking lap steels that you carry around, which is very impractical. for gigs and stuff, and you don't have to do how most like lap steel players will get their minor chords is they'll slant the bar right so that it's on a diagonal or an angle like backwards or forwards. And I tried doing that, and my palsy said, no, you don't. That's not happening. We're not going there. And so I couldn't. And this was the big game changer. And so eventually, after about doing lap steel, traditional lap steel for about a year, the guitar player who I just invited into my metal band happened to be a welder. That's what he did for his day job. I told him about Brian. He came with me. He came down to Grossman's. He met Brian. He told Brian and Brian was looking at getting an extra set of slides made for himself, anyways. So, as a thank you for letting him join my band, my friend Andrew made me my pair of slides, and he worked with Brian. Brian showed him how they were constructed. We fitted them to my hands, and I remember we were in his garage at like midnight one night, and he was just welding away, and it was very unsafe and just like sparks flying everywhere. But it was just kind of like very DIY. And so as a result, I know people can't see this because they're listening to audio, but this was the result,
Wow.
as you can see here. And so that's how that got made. And then Brian found my thumb slide from like a piece of pipe he found on a train track, because sometimes he would go out to train tracks to find weird pieces of metal that would make really good slides. Brian was kind of odd like that, like he was a bit of a country boy. So he would just go out and just do shit like that. And it was like the perfect thumb slide. And that's how my slides got made. And I think before that, I like tried to construct a pair myself using like a brass slide and like a really heavy piece of chrome brass, which didn't work out very well. But I remember the first time I came up on stage to Grossman's at the Jam with the two slides, and Brian got shocked. And then Paul McNamara, Brian's bass player, sees me with the two slides, and he goes, "Whoa!" And then Bill Hedefine, who was on the drum, says, "You're seeing double." and so I finally got up the courage to go up there with the double slides after kind of just working it out by trial and error with Frank, how to get the minor chords. And then that was about after I'd been with Frank for about 6 or 7 years. So that was the point where Frank said, "I think we've taken it as far as we can take it, and I think you need to take lessons with Brian." And that's kind of when I made the switch over to Brian as my mentor and my teacher, and I asked him to like formally teach me.
How long did it take for you to feel comfortable playing? I mean, obviously because you had your chops with the piano and you knew how to play music at a certain level. How long did it take for your guitar playing to get to a level that you were comfortable with?
Are we set by comfortable? Do we mean like where? Do we mean we're like I'm getting good at the instrument, or do we mean we're like I'm not struggling with it?
No, like that you're good with it.
I wouldn't say. People would disagree, but I wouldn't say I got there until after Brian passed in 2016. It took me a really, 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 really long time. I think when I released my first record, Parliament, in 2014, I was decent at it. But I think after Brian passed away, that kind of lit the fire underneath my butt. And that's when I got like super, like I was serious about it before, but I realized, oh shit, I have a legacy to carry on, you know? And that's, so I think that kind of drove me to, really get really good at it. So I would say it probably took me about, I have to think about, I actually have to think about this now. Maybe 12 years, 13 years.
Okay, so getting good and competent at the guitar to do what you hope to do, that I guess I would think that you have an idea in your head and you want to execute it, is one thing. But the other thing is actually writing your own songs,
Yeah.
which you have done for your albums. Now, tell me about that transition. Was writing songs an easy thing for you?
I don't know. It's like I don't think I really thought about it. I think I just sort of did it. To be to be honest with you, I didn't really give too much thought to it. I think at that point Brian had been mentoring me for several years. I only ever took about like 3 formal lessons with him. The rest of my mentoring was all on stage at Grossman's of just like watching him like a hawk. And he would turn to me and he would say, "It's this chord right here." And he'd show me, and I'd have 1 second to get it. And if I didn't get it, too bad. And so it was really the school of hard knocks. And like I remember he would run me through the shittiest transistor amp, this horrible tinny little amp, and everybody sounded like crap through it, but he'd run it through me on purpose so I couldn't hide behind distortion or overdrive or pedals because Brian famously hated pedals, and he would frown on me every time I brought out a tube screamer or something like that. And he's like, you need to learn to play the instrument, not play the pedal. And I years later I finally got what he was talking about. But he'd run me through these shitty amps and force me to play clean and force me to play accurate. And he'd give me shit about palm muting in my right hand because in lap steel, one of the hardest things about it is you have to mute with both hands at the same time in order to get a good, clean, consistent sound so that any unwanted strings aren't sounding. And for somebody who has palsy, that's really tough. Like my right hand has so many spasms all the time, it's constantly bouncing up and down. So to keep it like down like an anchor on the strings, I still struggle with it every day. But Brian really he worked me. He really, 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 really worked me. And then at some point when I got halfway decent at it, I was playing a computer game called Fallout 3, which is about a post apocalyptic United States. And at some point, I thought, nobody's ever done post apocalyptic Canada before. I should write an album about that. I should write a blues rock opera about that. And I'll make my first record, and it'll sell millions, and it'll be great. And of course, it barely sold anything. Um, but like, because you're young and you're full of piss and vinegar and you have all these wild aspirations and you have no concept of reality when you're in your 20s. You think you're like on top of the world, right? And so I just like I had enough confidence. It's like I've got the theory training. I'm decent at guitar. I'm pretty good at piano. Hell yeah, I can do this. Like I was 26 or 27 and I just started writing, and it would it was like I came up with like a riff. Like the very first thing I think I came up with was the main riff for Parliament Got Bombed. And then I couldn't come up with the rest of the song. And then 6 months later, when I was at my uncle's place for Christmas, all of a sudden the chords came to me. And so it would be rather sporadic until one day I remember there was like a week where like I wrote 5 songs in a week, and they were all really decent. And I would just have like bursts of creativity, and I realized, oh, um, uh, I realized, oh, I guess I've got enough to make a record. I should probably go make a record. Now, at this point, Baco, I should say I was at York University for biblical studies, um, secular biblical studies, and I had dreams of becoming a biblical studies professor
Oh,
in in the Hebrew Bible and the Ugaritic languages and all the ancient Semitic languages. And but I was slowly becoming aware that I was at the wrong school for this. I should have been at U of T, and it was going to take another 10 years of undergraduate like uh part-time courses in languages to get the undergraduate language prerequisites in Hebrew and Aramaic to go do what I wanted. Now, I'd already been at York for like 12 years at this point as a part-time student. So I was feeling really burnt out. And I thought, what do I do? And like one of my Hebrew Bible studies professors, Professor Ehrlich, he said to me, you know, um, take a year off, take a sabbatical. At this point, I just got married, and I'd um, I was like, okay, I'll take the year off, and I thought about it, and that was probably around like 2011, and the class in which I um, was taking ancient Greek in, one of my classmates said, "You should meet my daughter, Natalie. She has a recording studio um, a- a- in the East End." And I said, "Oh, okay." So Michael Beaupre put me in touch with his daughter, Natalie. And I went and I met her, and it was up above this little carpentry shop on Eastern Avenue that's like no longer there. And it was like, I guess, in like somebody's attic on the roof. And it was like a studio slash jam space. And Natalie, I played her a couple of songs. She liked them. And she was basically at the point where she was just trying to build up her resume as an engineer. So she you know, didn't charge me much of anything. And I'm like, well, I need money to make a record. So I was a very bad boy, and I took all the bursary money that I'd just gotten from like the university, and I used it to make my first record. York is probably going to be very, very, very disappointed with me. And then a couple months later, when we had after rehearsals, and we had like 5 weeks to rehearse, and it was just very chaotic and very scrambling. I told my parents I'm dropping out of university and becoming a musician. You can imagine how well that went over.
But at that point, this is what you wanted to do. This was now your new goal.
Yeah, this was now my new goal. I realized the biblical studies thing was it was a pipe dream, you know, and I wasn't going to get anywhere with it. I was probably going to end up being miserable, and I realized how much joy playing music and playing double slide and playing guitar was really bringing me.
Did you have a sense of what becoming a full time musician would be? And did you have an idea of what you wanted to get out of that? Like, what was the goal? What did you think you would hope to be being a full time musician?
Well, originally I wanted to be a session player and be a session guitarist, and how I started doing the cross genre thing that I'm known for in my music is that was done on purpose on my first record to try and like show versatility as a musician so I could get session work. But as I soon found out, well, double slide's not really in cause for session musicians. As Brian and I used to joke that we're an endangered species of two. Now one. But uh, yeah. So to answer your first question, I had no fucking clue what being a full time professional musician meant. I was so naive. I thought I was going to tour everywhere and sell out stadiums. Again, like delusions of grandeur that we get in our 20s.
Okay, so once you realize that you're not selling hundreds of thousands of units of your Parliament album, that you're not getting stadium gigs, what does that do to you? What when you had these dreams and it doesn't happen, what are you thinking?
I'm disappointed. And at the same time, I'm really happy doing what I'm doing. Like at that point, I was a subway musician with the TTC, so I was going out every day to busk, and that busking, along with playing with Brian every Sunday, that really honed my craft. When you just play alone in a subway with just yourself and a resonator, and with a resonator you can't really palm mute, so it's very honest. Like I've got a National steel guitar, and it's very honest with me. It lets me know when I'm messing up. Same with the Telecaster. That's also a reason why I play a Telecaster, is because Tellies are honest and they won't bullshit with you. Um, and so that really helped me build my chops. But at some point, I realized, you know what? I'm really enjoying this. I'm making people happy. I'm doing what I love. I'm sure that if I keep going with this, maybe I won't sell out stadiums, but I'm pretty sure that like I can get a career in music doing what I love, being happy with it. And I'd much rather be doing this than working a 9 to 5 in an office somewhere every day and, doing like soulless work. I did that 1 year for a summer job and I hated it. Never again. Never, ever, ever again.
Okay, so then you say, I'm going to record another album. It takes you 7 years. Is that correct?
7 bloody fucking years.
7 years
Yeah.
because why?
Well, it's because I had some money and then I had enough money to do 4 days. And I'd met my producer, Chris Burkett, after he saw me play it at Blue Dogs on King Street, which is no longer there with my band. We warmed up with BB King, and he was like, "Let's make a record together." He was so impressed with my double slide technique; he'd never seen anything like it. And he's like, "Let's make a record together." So I'm like, "Sure." So I got enough money together to record about 4 days with the bed tracks in the studio, and then I ran out of money. And then I realized, oh shit, I need to apply for grants, but I didn't know how to write grants, and it took me 4 years to get my first grant, and I did the uh, overdubs in 2019 and the bed tracks in 2016. And actually, the last day on the bed tracks that we did the bed tracks was the last day I got to see Brian before he passed, about maybe a month before he passed away. And I used his old Gibson acoustic in the studio. And then after he passed away, he willed me Brownie, his old Telecaster that he was really well known for playing. That's on the front cover of my record, and that was him. That's like his soul. Like he fucking toured and pioneered double slide guitar on that guitar for over 40 years and went through hell and back with that guitar. Brian was very much, he was like my dad to me. He was like a second dad to me, and he was family to me, and he meant the world to me. So I think when he passed away, it was a real blow. It was a huge, huge shock and a huge like crash to my life. And I think I became really depressed after he died. And even though I had this fire lit underneath my butt, I was feeling burdened. And I think I still do in a sense because I think I'm expected to carry on his legacy, which I'm happy to do. But I think people, they come up to me and they're like, you sound just like Brian, or you play just like Brian, or they expect me to be him. And I have to explain to them that I'm not, And so I'm finding these days I'm trying to find a way to get out from somebody else's shadow to find my own voice and express myself. And I think I'm still on that journey, and I'm on that process in terms of where I am. And I think the one thing that I know about myself in making music is that I never do anything anybody expects. I always do something very unexpected and something very untraditional. And even if I do traditional blues music, I'll do queer blues music and put my own twist on it and just do something wildly unorthodox because that's just me. And I think I really took that spirit from Brian, where he just carved his own path and he did it his own way, and he was his own person. And he told me so many times, he's like, I'm so glad that you don't sound like me, because the last thing I want is for you to be a clone of me. I want you to sound like you. I like that you're different from me. And so that really meant the world to me, and that really encouraged me. And so I think when I kind of feel like I get stuck in his shadow a little bit from other people's expectations, I remember what he said to me, and I kind of like, nah, this is other people's, problems. I gotta let them go and go do my own thing, wherever that is, and wherever my heart takes me. And I'm pretty sure no matter what I do, wherever Brian is, he's proud of me. You know?
Well, then you also think, I mean, just the fact that you are carrying on his tradition, and obviously you're going to sound like you more than you're going to sound like him. But the fact that people are reminded of him because of you, I think speaks volumes. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, it
I
does.
mean,
It
what
does.
an amazing tribute that your playing gives to people if they are reminded of Brian, because nobody else played like Brian, and you're probably the only other person who plays like Brian. So, but I can understand how you would feel that way.
Yeah, it's. I think it's part of the grieving process, which I'm still going through 5 years on
Hmm.
after losing him. He was just an enormous influence in my life. Like, never did I think when I started playing guitar that I would get to take on somebody else's musical legacy and carry on a completely new, not just a new style of playing, but Brian invented a new instrument. Like, that's the thing that a lot of people don't realize. It was what he did was so revolutionary, because before him, the lap steel was in the back of the band, the slide guitar was in the back of the band. It was an instrument that maybe occasionally did some fills and stuff, but it never really got the spotlight. It never really, you know, was anything you could be a front man with, or a front person with, I should say. And Brian changed all of that. He blew the doors wide open. And he didn't know what he was doing. He didn't have a background in music theory. Like, when he met me, I would give him lessons on music theory. Like, he would ask me the difference between an augmented and a diminished chord. And I've still got recordings from my very first lesson with him where we're fighting over what constitutes a diminished versus an augmented chord. And I'm actually teaching him, and it's really funny to me to listen to that recording now, looking back on it. But uh like, he didn't have the theory, so he figured all that stuff trial and error. He might not have known what the chords were called or what he was doing theoretically, but he knew the instrument. And like, when I think about it, and I just think about the intricacies of, like, the only reason I've been able to get as far on double slide with it as I have is because of my theory background. So like, I know like what builds the chord and what's going to connect the chords. Like, I've started doing voice leading and stuff, and all those piano lessons are coming in very, very useful. But Brian had none of that. So he was in a much more tougher and difficult position than I'm in. Like, I have the advantage of learning from him and watching him and seeing the shapes with the slides. He had no one to watch. He had no one to learn from or mentor him. He had to figure it out all by himself. And that blows my mind every time I think about it. He was an absolute genius.
For sure.
Really, really and truly.
Um, Mike, I'm going to have to wrap this up, but I want to say what a pleasure it was to talk to you and meet you. I know that in 2020 you won the TBS Talent Contest.
Yep.
Your new album, Outside the Box, just came out. Tell me, my last question to you is now, a few years older, a few years more wiser, what are your goals at this point?
I'd like to be able to tour Canada, at least. I don't know if the virus is going to let me. I'm very high risk for COVID. I can't even go out and play bars like most musicians are doing nowadays. I don't have that privilege. Um, Both my partner and I are very high risk. So I have to be extra careful and super safe. And so all I can really do right now is like outside festival gigs in Ontario, and that's it. So I'm crossing my fingers, and I'm hoping that the virus will mutate just enough where it gets about as deadly as the flu, because I don't think it's going to get any less deadly than that. But I hope it gets down to about there so I can start touring places, and touring Canada and getting outside Ontario, maybe even going to the States eventually. But I'm sort of in a position right now where I know what I'd like to do, and I'd like to be able to just release albums and make my art and tour and make a nice living off it and make people happy. But because we're sort of in the uncertainty of the pandemic and the virus, all bets are off. So I don't know if reality's going to let me do it or not. I hope so. But I'm sort of in a very unpredictable place right now because of the way things are. So I have hopes and I have dreams. Whether or not reality lets me see those dreams to fruition, I'm going to have to wait and see.
Are you constantly writing?
Yeah, that's the one thing I have been doing during the pandemic is I have been constantly writing new material. I've been doing a secret project in my office here. I'm not telling anybody what that's about. All I'll say is that I've been learning how to record and produce, and I've been renting microphones and figuring out how to record my amp and basically how to mix and stuff. So I'm working on it. And I'll say I'm really happy with how it's turning out. So it's going to be a big surprise, or for people who know me, maybe it won't be. And I'll leave it at that. Okay. I'll leave it at that. I don't want to say too much more.
Mike, thank you so much for doing this. It's a real pleasure meeting you. You're an impressive person, and I hope that one day our paths will cross, not in the too distant future.
Yeah, Nagoda, this was an absolute, real pleasure, and really thank you for having me on. When I saw all the people you interviewed, I was like, what's he want to talk to me for? He's interviewed Steve fucking Vai. Like I only have my second record out. What is this? So I was thrilled, and this has been an absolute pleasure. So hopefully when my next record comes out, or like after that or whatever, we cross paths again and we talk again. I've really loved the last hour, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.